Hello and welcome to the Point Blank Show. My name is Abhishek. My guest today is Dr. Anna Lembke. Dr. Lembke is a psychiatrist and the chief of the Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic at Stanford University School of Medicine. Over many years, she has treated patients with addictions of all kinds, including behavioral ones. Her book, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, is unputdownable. It brings to life real stories of her patients and how they struggled through addiction before breaking it. Thank you so much, Dr. Lembke, for doing this.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. And I owe you one a little bit, is that I tried something that you recommend in your book, which has helped me deal with a bad habit which borders on addiction, and that's ice creams. So the thing is, I would have it every 2 or 3 days, and I didn't know until a friend of mine joked with me that if your son, also who's 4 years old now, develops a taste of ice cream as much as you do, then you'll have to dedicate some portion of your salary to deal with it. But then I wasn't, and yet I wasn't aware of it while I was going through it. And I think you talk about how you have to abstain from it for 30 days. So I tried to put myself through that test, and it was ludicrous in that I had to delete some apps and also physically look away from the ice cream store when I'm passing through it. I don't know how silly that is, but then it helped me. It's not that I've quit ice cream altogether, but that has indeed helped.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because I think it really humanizes an experience that so many of us, if not all of us, have in this day and age, where we start a behavior that seems innocent enough. Certainly it's normalized by our culture. Other people are doing it, no big deal. And then we develop a kind of habit around it. And then slowly over time, we actually develop a kind of a compulsive orientation without being able to see it happening as it occurs. And as you know, and as I write about in my book, that happened to me with romance novels, right? So I read a book called The Twilight Saga, which was about teenage vampires. And for whatever reason, it just sucked me in. I read it 4 times. Then I, read other vampire romance novels, and I was sort of off and running. And over the course of 2 years, by the end of that, without seeing the progression, I was compulsively and in an addictive way consuming romance novels all the time, even, at work between patients. So I think it's really important for us to realize the ways in which so many of the substances and behaviors that we engage in the modern world have become drugified, made more potent, more accessible, more bountiful, more novel, such that once we begin using them, it's very easy to get into this vortex of addiction.
Right. And the pleasure that a romance novel might bring you, or an ice cream in my case, what I also learned from your book is that even pain, which sits at the other end of the spectrum, and pleasure are like Siamese twins, let's say, tied at the hip in the brain. How does that work? In that it's that the same brain circuits is what I read in your book that give you pain, also give you pleasure, which is quite phenomenal.
Yeah, so this is a really exciting finding in neuroscience in the past 50 to 75 years, that pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain. So by very many different measurements, whether it's animal studies or brain imaging or electrophysiologic studies, what we see is that the same parts of the brain that process pleasure process pain, and they work like opposite sides of a balance. So if you imagine there's like a seesaw or a teeter-totter, a beam on a central fulcrum, that is a metaphor for how we process pleasure and pain. When we experience pleasure, it tips one way. When we experience pain, it tips the other. And understanding how this balance works is really key to understanding what happens in our brains as we become addicted, which is to say that there are certain rules governing this balance. And the first and most important rule is the balance wants to remain level, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis. And it's an overwhelming urge for the brain to restore homeostasis after any deviation from neutrality. And the way that our brains do that is first by tilting an equal and opposite amount to whatever the initial stimulus is. So I read a romance novel that releases dopamine, our reward neurotransmitter, in the reward pathway of the brain. My balance tilts to the side of pleasure. But no sooner has that happened than my brain adapts to that increased dopamine transmission by down-regulating dopamine firing, not just to baseline, but below baseline. That is called neuroadaptation. I like to imagine that as these gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But the gremlins like it on the balance, so they don't get off as soon as it's level. They stay on until the balance is tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. And that's that come down, the after effect, the hangover, or that moment of wanting one more piece of chocolate, which, by the way, can occur even while I'm still eating the first piece, right? Just like we can have an urge to want to watch another TikTok video even before we finish the first TikTok video. And that's that balance tilted to the side of pain. Now, if we wait long enough, maybe it's seconds, maybe it's minutes, maybe it's hours, but eventually, if we don't consume more, the gremlins hop off and homeostasis is restored. But while the gremlins are there, with easy access to our drug of choice, the urge to consume more is very, very strong. And if we do consume more over days to weeks to months to years, we accumulate more and more gremlins on the pain side of the balance until there's enough to fill this whole room. And now we're entering into addicted brain. What that means is we're in a chronic dopamine deficit state. That initial response to pleasurable stimuli, that deviation of pleasure, gets weaker and shorter, but that after response gets stronger and longer. And in effect, our pleasure-pain balance gets stuck on the side of pain. That's what happens in addiction. Then people need to use just to feel normal. And when they're not using, they're experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving.
That doesn't sound good.
No.
So, in other words, if we don't wait long enough, or rather, if we don't stave off that the next TikTok video, then what I understand from you is that we need that much amount each time just to stay normal. So in other words, if the dopamine or that pleasure chemical, whatever gets released up there, which would happen by just one scoop of ice cream or whatever, that you need more of that. So the whole idea that they taught us in economics is the more you have of a thing, the less you want to have more of it. It doesn't work anymore then. Because that's
yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Now, some of this is based on quantity and frequency. Quantity and frequency matter, right? So if you have ice cream or I read a romance novel, right, and those gremlins hop on the pain side of the balance. And by the way, once the gremlins are created, they never entirely go away. They might hop off the pain side of the balance, but they're waiting in the wings. So that with any re-exposure to ice cream in your case, or romance novels in my case, they're already created and they're going to hop on and slam us down to the side of pain into that state of craving. On the other hand, if we can space out our consumption enough, leaving days in between, and consume in moderation so that we leave enough time for the gremlins to get off of the balance and for homeostasis to be restored, then we won't get into that chronic dopamine deficit state. So it's not to say that we should never experience intoxicants, because essentially food today is an intoxicant, right? It's more fat, more sugar, more salt, more flavorants. It's all much tastier than it ever was. It releases dopamine in our reward pathway. So we can ingest those types of very rich foods as long as we do it in small amounts and we do it intermittently. So we leave enough time for homeostasis to be restored.
And what I found another bit interesting in your book is that you talk about dopamine. So just help us explain a little bit more of it. Like, for example, let's say when a gambler is about to place his bet, there is a spike, he feels happy, or that uncertainty of winning or losing, or it could be an alcoholic walking by a bar and then he's wondering, should I go in? So there is what happens in the head when you are titillated by some of your cravings. What happens exactly?
Yeah, so this is a great point, which is to say, we know that the drug releases dopamine in the reward pathway, but it turns out that reminders of the drug can also release a little bit of dopamine in the reward pathway. So we get a little bit high just being reminded of our drug, or even just what's often called euphoric recall, thinking about using gets us a little bit high. But the key piece here that rodent experiments have shown is that after that little trigger that reminds us of the drug, it's followed by a little mini dopamine deficit state. So that same cycle with the gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance happens even with just reminders of the drug, not even the drug itself. That creates then that cycle of mini intoxication and mini craving. And once we're in craving, then we're very, very motivated to do the work to get the reward. If you just think about when your phone is in your pocket and you hear a bing or you hear a vibration, you know you got a text, that creates a little bit of dopamine followed by a little bit of dopamine deficit, a craving. And now you can't even focus on anything else you're doing. All you're thinking is, I'm going to check my phone. I'm going to check my phone. I'm going to check my phone. That's what happens in the brain in this cycle.
And can some of it be harmless as well? It takes me back to school. Let me give you an example. Every day at around 4:45 p.m. to 5 p.m., I would have a physical reaction to leave the books aside, go down and play, pick up the bat, because it was a release. Now, is that because now that when I read your book, I find, wow, even, I mean, perhaps there is a dopamine rush during that time, but that may not be bad because it's a physical sport. So it need not be bad at all times then. Would my understanding be right?
That's exactly right. Dopamine is not our enemy, right? We need dopamine for survival. Without dopamine, we wouldn't have the desire to do anything. There's a super famous experiment in which rats were engineered to not have any dopamine receptors in the reward pathway. And what the researchers found was that if they put food in the rat's mouth, it would eat the food and seem to get pleasure from the food. But if they put it even a body length away, the rat would starve to death.
Wow.
In other words, we need dopamine for motivation to do the work, to live our lives, right? And so it's okay to get excited about things and want to do things and to look forward to them. The problem is that we have now drugified our world to the point where these substances and behaviors release way more dopamine than our ancient brains were evolved for, right? We were evolved for a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, in which we would have to walk tens of kilometers every day just to find a little bit of water and a little bit of food and, another tribe. And that's what we're evolved for. That's why this mechanism is built the way that it is. It's terribly mismatched for our modern ecosystem, in which we have these cheap pleasures everywhere we turn.
So isn't that ironic that as things are becoming easier, we are, pretty much going to the dogs in that we get disturbed. There's no concept of boredom. I've seen people, and I've been guilty of that. You're calling the elevator or the lift, as we call it here, from the 6th floor to the ground floor, you pick up your phone. In the lavatory, men, they're checking their phones while taking a leak. At a conference recently, I found a guy who was drinking tea in a saucer or a cup, and he had his phone. On the other hand, he was checking his office email. You take your phone to your bed. So what is that? Is it that we don't want to be distracted? Is it too much leisure? Are we getting too lazy? Because if you ask my grandfather, he had a different life altogether. And are we getting softer over the years? Are things too easy, and that's causing us all this harm then?
Well, I don't like to phrase it as things are too easy. What it is what I call the plenty paradox. You're absolutely right. We have reached this tipping point where we have not only all of our basic survival needs met, but we have all of these pleasures, right at our fingertips. We're insulated from painful experiences, especially physically painful experiences. And the result is that we're all caught in this dopamine vortex, where now we're so used to being stimulated that when we're not being stimulated, we experience withdrawal, and withdrawal is painful. So it's not, the frame is not like we're soft and weak and morally compromised compared to our grandparents. It's that we're living in an environment that is really conspiring against us without our realizing it. And so, we're caught in this dopamine cycle of intoxication, dopamine free fall, which is painful, which drives craving, which then motivates us to do the work to get more drug. And then what ends up happening is not only are people on their phones doing all the things, but now they're watching a Netflix movie and on their phones, right? Because the movie itself isn't enough, and the phones itself, or they're on the phones and they're smoking cigarettes, or now we need to combine two drugs together to overcome tolerance. And this And what you realize is that there's no end. Like eventually we will all hit the wall where we're just miserable. And we're miserable because we're constantly chasing pleasures. And these pleasures are driving our dopamine levels downward. So it's really physiological. It's really this mismatch between our brains and the world that we humans have created.
And sometimes it's okay just to be, right, without distractions. I think I like your line from the book, and I quote that boredom is also an opportunity for discovery and invention, unquote. Is that
Yeah.
it's all right, and maybe you can let your thoughts wander. What happens in that time in the head when you try and keep that smartphone away? And here, when we talk about smartphone, it's not drug or alcohol, but behavioral addiction. So what exactly happens there when we are
Well,
bored?
I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that when we first give up that constant stimulation, whatever it's from,
Hmm.
we do go into withdrawal, and it's a very uncomfortable feeling. And boredom,
Right.
it can be scary, because boredom also prompts us to think about deep questions like, why am I here? Why do I live? Why do I die? And
Hmm.
that's super scary for people. But if we can just allow ourselves to sit with the quiet and just kind of contemplate, eventually our brains calm down. They
Hmm.
really do. And we get into our default mental resting network, where we have, cross brain synchrony, which is so important for things like creativity, well-being, a feeling of groundedness,
Hmm.
serenity, all of these things. What happens today is that we're constantly reacting to these external stimuli. And even
Right.
when we don't have external stimuli, we're interrupting our own thoughts, telling ourselves to check, for more external stimuli. So
Hmm.
when we first give that up, it is an intense sensation of withdrawal and discomfort. But if we can just stick with those uncomfortable feelings, they eventually subside,
Right.
and we can really find the ground of our being. I had a patient who was from South Korea, a young woman who came to me for anxiety and depression and irritability. And I discovered, as I was getting to know her, that she was constantly plugged in. From the moment she woke up in the morning to the moment she went to bed, she was listening to music or watching something. When she walked to class, everything. And so I said, well, my homework for you is that you unplug for certain periods of the day. For example, why don't
Right.
you try walking to class without listening to music? So she did that, and she came back a month later and she said, well, at first it was really hard because it was really boring. Like, I
Hmm.
was walking, I was like, this is really boring. This is really boring. But she said after a while, she started to notice the trees,
Hmm.
which I just thought was such a great, like, that's right.
Yeah.
We go from
Yeah.
being internally fixated with our own sensations and emotional experience to being able to be grounded enough to pay attention to the world. And
Right.
that's where we really come alive, when we're living in an experience where we can interact with our environment. I
Right.
think that's what we're losing almost more, that people are not present. They're not tuning out and paying
Right.
attention to the people and things around them. We're
Hmm.
lesser for it.
Right. In fact, there was an advertisement in India. I don't recall by whom, where the tagline was "Look up," because the ad
Yes.
showed everyone is just
Right.
looking into their smartphones and
Right.
the
Right.
trees and the
Right.
birds and the like. So then, what is addiction according to you? Although it goes back to the Roman era, where being addicted, as I read, it was equated with slavery. In that, if you
Mm,
as a feeling of enslaved. So if you owed anyone some
right.
money, you were sentenced to slavery. But today it's more of a bond addiction that is hard to break. But how do you define it, and how do you put it?
Well, I think slavery is an interesting metaphor. When we're addicted, we really are enslaved to the substance or behavior. We may have the illusion that we're choosing, but really our drug is
Hmm.
choosing us. We lose autonomy. We lose the ability to be free of that substance or behavior. Formally defined, addiction is the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite harm to self and or others. Sometimes we sort of truncate the definition to say, look for the 3 C's: control, compulsion, and consequences.
Hmm.
Control means I repeatedly try to cut back and I'm not able to. I repeatedly try to say I'm going to stick to certain amounts and I don't stick to those amounts. Compulsion is a whole lot of my mental real estate occupied with using the drug, obtaining the drug, covering up my use, a narrowing of my mental focus, and
Hmm.
also this kind of level of automaticity again, where I can even go into a somewhat dissociative state and initiate use and not even realize it. We hear that all the time. And number 3, consequences, and those consequences can be physical health consequences, relationship consequences, school, job, you name
Right.
it, spiritual consequences where I'm engaging in activities contrary to my goals and values
Hmm.
because I've prioritized consumption of this drug or behavior. So that's how we define addiction. Another way that people sometimes think about addiction is false worship, where we kind of replace a relationship with a divine being with this substance or behavior, and we come to really worship it, but it's not the thing that we really need.
Right.
It's kind of a false substitute.
Right. And can the mind be trained to know when you are falling in that trap? Because often it's in hindsight when somebody points that out, or maybe you're sitting and looking at YouTube shorts or TikTok, then you realize it's 40 minutes you're in it. So what can the mind be trained? And or maybe is it a routine? Is that common sense that we are missing out on? What how exactly can we get that right? Because smart people do stupid things.
Oh, all the time. You can count me in that group. So, here's the thing. We have very vivid memory for pain and pleasure. If you think about when you look back at your life memories, the most intense and vivid memories will be for the intensely pleasurable or intensely painful things that have happened.
Right.
But we have very poor memory for the gremlins. So we have good memory for the initial stimulus, poor memory for the after effect or the opponent process mechanism. And because we have such a poor memory of the gremlins on both sides. So for example, I don't think we talked about this, but just as when we press on the pleasure side, the gremlins hop on the pain side. If we intentionally press on the pain side, those gremlins will hop on the pleasure side. And this can be a healthy way to get your dopamine indirectly. For example, exercise to get the runner's high, or ice cold water immersion, or prayer or meditation, anything that's effortful, but not too painful. Painful, but not too painful, like not cutting, right? That's bad. That's too much pain.
Right.
So not self-harm, but what's called hormesis, just the right-sized pain to get those gremlins to hop on the pleasure side to get dopamine indirectly. That can be a healthy source of dopamine. But here's the thing. Every morning when I wake up, I forget. Literally, I forget. I cannot capture in my mind how good I feel after exercising. I don't have any memory for it.
Right.
All I can think of is I do not want to get out of bed and I do not want to exercise, right? But after I exercise, I'm so glad I did it. My day is so much better, right? So we don't remember the gremlins. And likewise with intoxicants, even if we have huge problems with our drug of choice, right? We've gotten into trouble repeatedly with drugs or alcohol or pornography. All we can remember is how good it feels. Even after it stops feeling good, we just remember that initial stimulus. We don't remember the gremlins.
Right.
Because of that, we have to build an infrastructure around ourselves to remind us of the gremlins. Okay.
Right.
So that's things like you and I talking about it, right? You and I having this dialogue serves as a kind of extended hippocampus to remind ourselves of this problem. This is how things like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, and other 12-step groups, people come together and they tell their stories and they remind themselves, oh, these are all the things that happen when I engage in using my drug. We can do things like what I call self-binding strategies, where we put barriers between ourselves and our drug of choice, or we do things that are positive that gear us toward doing the good behaviors, right? So for example, I won't bring any technology in my bedroom. There I create a geographic barrier between myself and my devices, so I'm less likely to go on them as I'm, trying to cultivate sleep and rest. But I might put my running shoes right next to my bed so that when I get up in the morning, I see them there. It's like, okay, yeah, I remember last night I wanted to go running in the morning. I don't want to go now. I actually don't run. I don't run. I walk. But anyway, whatever. I don't want to go walking now, but there are my shoes. So at some point I did want to do that, right? So those types of things.
Yes. So it shouldn't matter how you feel. If you have a routine, you have to stick by it. I think you were on Joe Rogan podcast as well, which I quite enjoyed listening to you there. And in some other episode, Joe Rogan talks about this, that if I exercise only when I feel good, then I'm going to be a fat, miserable person.
Right.
So but it's normal to feel miserable in the first few minutes of waking up in the morning to go for that run. It's just our mind doesn't remember the pleasure after that workout or the run, and that's why it forces us to just shake us off from that place.
Exactly. I always say it's actions before feelings. It's funny because in mental health today we talk a lot about feelings and people tuning into their
Right.
feelings and, being authentic to their feelings and being mindful of their feelings. And that's instructive to a point, but sometimes our feelings are not our best guide, especially when it comes to dopamine. And what we have to do is do the good actions to get the good feelings, not wait till we feel like doing the good actions, because that will never come.
That's interesting because I remember a podcast of Jerry Seinfeld, the great comedian, with I think it was anyway. So the interviewer asks him that, "Are you always working?" And he says, "Yes, I write jokes for a living, and I'm working all the time. So even when I'm here talking to you, I'm looking for material." And and he says that, there's nothing. So he takes a jibe at the it was Howard Stern, I think. And then he asks, but isn't that a miserable way to live? And he says, no, it's not. It's like going to the gym every day and you feel that, I have got to do this again. He says that, hey, it's a tortured life. I said, yes, but your blessing in life is when you find the torture that you're comfortable with, is what Seinfeld responds. So the dopamine that he gets is probably by writing those jokes, but it's not easy.
Right.
It's
that's right. That's right. And I think a key here is that we were really wired for pain. We were evolved to experience enormous amounts of suffering and survive it.
Right.
And my hypothesis about why we're so unhappy, so many of us are so unhappy today, is because we're not really experiencing adequate amounts of pain to reset our reward pathways to the side of pleasure. We're suffering, but it's not because we have too much pain. It's because we have too little of the right kind of pain. And so by leaning into pain and pursuing, a new form of asceticism where we intentionally seek out things that are hard, especially things that give us meaning and purpose, is really a much better life than a life where you're always just trying to make yourself comfortable.
And how do you react to some strategies that are out there on the internet and even, psychologists have given it, that you give yourself a reward at the end of doing that routine so that in the quest to get that reward, you'll get the routine done. Now, there's also the other school of thought that why don't you consider the routine itself a reward? So how does that work?
Right. Yeah. So, to some degree, I think looking forward to a modest reward at the end of a difficult activity can be a reasonable strategy. The problem is that the rewards today are so potent, and we've done so much of bracketing our lives by looking forward to rewards that we've taken it way, way, way too far. And now, our brains are it's like constantly, well, where's my next reward? Where's my next reward? That's the problem. What's a very interesting kind of thought experiment to do is go through your whole day. So this is a little bit different from the dopamine fast that I recommend, where we eliminate the drug of choice for 4 weeks to reset reward pathways. This is where instead go through a whole day where you don't do any of those little things that are your little reward. So like, you don't have your cup of coffee in the morning. You eat breakfast, but you don't include that like thing that gives you that zing, and you don't, binge on Netflix at night, and just do that for one day. And it really changes how we move through the day. And what I've experienced is it has us much more present in the moment, because it's like right now you and I were talking, and if I were thinking, okay, as soon as I'm done with this podcast, I'm going to have myself a cupcake, then the whole time I'm talking to you, I'm actually, with part of my brain, I'm thinking about that cupcake. Whereas instead, if there's no reward at the end of our time together, then here we are. This is it. You and I, right? That's all we got. So I'm all in, right? Let's make the most of it. And then you have a very different orientation on time, on what's happening to you right now. So I think it's really important for us just individually and collectively to reorient on rewards more broadly. Because what's happened is all of us now, and we do it with our kids too, all day long, it's like, here's an M&M, here's a cookie, here's your show. It's like, no, here, scrub some toilets, make your bed, run around the block. And then your reward is like, you can sit here and like calmly rest now. That's your reward. So
Right.
it's, it's a funny thing, but I think we need to ratchet the whole thing back.
Yes. When you said that, let's say you and I are talking right now, it's about being in the moment
Yeah.
for its own sake and
Right.
nothing else then. And
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Except that a lot of times we talk about that,
Right.
but people think that, oh, being in the moment is going to be so great if I
Mm.
knew how to do being in the moment. But what people have to realize is like, no, being in the moment is actually can be hard.
Mm.
And it's even harder if you're looking forward to a reward later. You
Right.
almost can't do it. But if you don't have anything to look forward to, then all of a
Yeah.
sudden the moment becomes quite nice, right? Or you
Or that's the
you
only thing you
invest.
have.
That's all you have. So you
Yes.
invest in it, in a different way.
Right.
And then it is joyful because it is all you have.
Mm. Now, it makes me wonder about the little gifts or treats that we give our kids. I've got a 4.5 year
Right.
old, and he's quite a mischievous lad. So the one way that we've tried to pin him down sometimes is by giving him a star on a piece of paper. Now,
Right.
it's not anything that is physical, but
Right.
even that is a reward. Then, right? Then that's
Yeah.
possibly even if it's just a figurative star or
Right.
something. All right. So the whole idea is that can everyone just do it for its do that activity like it is meant to be, and that's about it. So what level of Buddha like we might have to be to get there then, or how difficult is it?
Yeah. Yeah. I think a star for a kid is like perfectly fine. It's not a cookie.
Hmm.
So, it's sort of symbolic of, in
Right.
a way, your approval and love. And so that's fine. That's absolutely fine.
Hmm.
I think what I'm saying is not so much that we should all suddenly be levitating like Buddha because we get this great insight. What
Right.
I'm saying is that our pleasure seeking, our
Hmm.
relentless reward and pleasure seeking, there's no end to it,
Right.
right? And that pleasure and pain are relative and
Hmm.
opposite. So the more that we ratchet up the rewards, the less
Right.
pleasurable things will be for us. So that the response is to avoid these highly reinforcing
Hmm.
substances and behaviors and instead intentionally do things that are hard,
Right.
right? So that we can reset our reward pathways so that more modest pleasures like a star
Hmm.
are actually pleasurable.
Yeah.
If you were letting your kid play video games, as a reward for good behavior and eat a chocolate cupcake and, I don't know what else, whatever the 1,000,001 things that buy a toy, then that star would mean absolutely nothing for that kid. He'd be like, where's my video game? Like
Right.
this star, get it out of here, right? But
Exactly.
clearly, if
Yeah.
your kid is responding to a star, you
Hmm.
guys are doing it right because there's not other more potent rewards.
Right, right. And now that you say that, I don't know how big a problem is it in the West. These days in India, parents now both husband and wife work. We don't have joint
Right.
family anymore, which means that there is a lot of pressure to get the kid to eat in the morning before he's out to school.
Ah,
Many of us have gotten into a habit of, putting the phone in front of
ah,
kids and who are 2, 3, 4 years old, so much so that
wow.
someone I know
Yeah.
said that that the kid is not eating. Why? Because there's no internet. So how does that work? Because he can't see YouTube, so he won't eat. So how
Right.
bad is it how
Yeah,
much
that's
wiring
terrible.
changes? Yeah,
That's
yeah.
terrible. Yeah, because clearly then now you're wiring this kid's brain to sort of link eating with watching this potent
Mm,
screen at a very young age when the brain is essentially pruning back the neuronal synapses that are not being used,
right,
myelinating and making more efficient the synapses that are being used frequently, creating the neuronal infrastructure that child will be left with their entire adult life. So this is
right.
very bad. And really shouldn't be
Yeah.
happening. I personally believe that a child under the age of 13 should not have access to their own device.
Mm,
And when they do engage with a screen, it should be intermittent and modest and monitored and all
right,
of that. I don't think that, but of course we have the same problem here. We have,
right.
and maybe not specifically around breakfast, but yeah,
Mm,
it's the ultimate and best babysitter, right? Put a kid in front of a screen and you don't have to
yeah.
talk to them for hours at a time, but it's not good for their brains. Then
Oh,
you know
right.
what's so interesting? You turn it off and the kids go crazy, right? They start screaming and kicking and yelling because they're in withdrawal, right? They're in direct withdrawal. So
yeah, I have a friend who says that he knew someone whose kid spoke with a Samsung accent. So he asked, "What is Samsung accent?" And then the joke was, and it's serious, but on a lighter note, that the kid was brought up on a Samsung tablet
yeah,
watching
oh gosh,
cartoons,
yeah,
and nobody spoke with him in an American accent, but
oh,
because he
that's
watched Peppa Pigs of the world or whatever there is,
right,
or
right.
no, Peppa Pig, I think is Brit, but the voiceover at least. But that's what it is. That their uh, brains were, I don't know what happens in the brain, but at least his behavior was such that he wouldn't speak. But when he spoke, it would be more like how a cartoon character would in that accent. So it
Oh,
can be,
weird.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. These are these apocryphal stories. There was a kid on an airplane who the
Mm.
battery ran out on the iPad. So the desperate parent pulled it away and had a book and gave the book to the kid. And the kid kept like pressing the book and trying to get the book to work.
Or maybe swipe a page
Yeah.
to,
Right. Right.
yeah. And so there is no, so you said 13 years. That's a good one. I'm going to remember that
Yeah.
try and keep them away from technology as far as you can. But
Yes, that's right.
how do there are some who, or mainly parents, who say that, hey, he's getting that much more interactive, or you can't. Today we live in a world where he or she will eventually hook up with phones. Why not introduce them early, and so that they have that exposure? But you said something interesting. It's not, there's something that goes wrong in the brain itself, and that the wiring is different. Is it because we are, again, evolution wise, we are not used to that kind of exposure at such an early age? What exactly happens? What are the pitfalls of introducing technology too early to kids?
Well, yeah. So first of all, and we hear this argument a lot. It's like, well, my kid needs to be, part of the tech revolution.
Yeah.
And if he doesn't have access to technology, he'll be behind, right? And
Mm.
that is so untrue. These kids, in adult, even if they're for the first time they ever touched a smartphone was when they were 15,
Yeah.
they would learn it in 24 hours and they would be better than the parents, in a week. Do you know what
Right.
I mean? I mean, it's
Yeah.
their brains are so plastic. They're so able to absorb information
Right.
in a nanosecond. They would
Mm.
master the technology. So you don't need all of those years building up to that.
Right.
And in fact, what happens if you do expose your kids to lots of screen time growing up is essentially their brain gets wired around using screens as an adaptive coping mechanism. And
Right.
again, it drives dopamine ultimately downward, so that
Wow.
then now your kid is going to be, screaming and in withdrawal when you try to take it away. You're hooking your kid
Mm.
on a digital drug, and that's no
Right.
good. Again, this doesn't
Wow.
mean throw the baby out
Mm.
with the bathwater.
Right.
Intermittent supervised use of
Yeah.
watching movies or playing games or social media is all okay. But in those early years, especially that first decade, we really need to lay the groundwork
Mm.
for our kids learning how to communicate in real life with real
Right.
people, how to do chores, how to do
Mm.
exercise, how to, organize themselves to do schoolwork, how to do things that are hard and difficult,
Right.
so that in their teens, when we no longer have control over them and they go get their own phones and do whatever they're going to do,
Yeah.
they at least have that foundation of
Mm.
knowing, both a neurological foundation and a sort of psychological, psychocultural foundation of knowing
Right.
what is kind of appropriate digital
Mm.
etiquette.
That's interesting, because there was long ago, when the iPad was selling like hotcakes when it was introduced. There was this New York Times journalist who, in an interview with Steve Jobs, in the passing while hanging up, said, "Hey, so your kids must be nerds in the house. They would be using, mobile phone, whatever, this iPad." He said, "No, they don't." He had moderated their use, and the interview goes on to talk about how he said they get only on weekends or some such. And then there is one more book by Adam Alter, Irresistible, something around technology, where he said that these bosses of these tech giants were technophobes. Even the TikTok
Right.
guy, I think he doesn't let his kid watch TikTok videos. So it's very real and present, the problem.
Oh, yeah. And, the people who made and engineered these highly addictive digital drugs won't let their own kids use them. So that speaks volumes, right?
Yeah.
So, this is they're putting it out there in the world, but
Right.
they're not letting their own progeny participate, because they know that
Right.
this digital media was engineered to be addictive, and they don't want their
Right.
kids to get addicted.
Right. And talking of that addiction, what is that line? And you would have been asked this question quite often, is
Yeah.
that uh, line between insane work ethic to pursue excellence versus complete madness of us. So
Right.
it's like, I think again, Joe Rogan had said something interesting, that insanity and greatness are next door neighbors and they borrow each
Yeah.
other's sugar. So it's
Right.
because there's a thin line. So how is that? Because some people dedicate their lives to a cause. It could be sports, and they
Yeah.
won't stop. It's like they are addicted. They have to get up in the morning and keep at it. It's right from Muhammad Ali to Sachin Tendulkar in India. So and we revere them, right? Because we want to be them.
Yes.
We may not have the
Right.
work ethic, so we don't get
Right.
anywhere half as
Right.
fraction as close to them, but we look up to them. So what is that line, and where how can we know that uh, we should push the envelope, but not so much that we lose our wits?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's not an easy one to answer, but I think the best approximation for an answer is, again, addiction is a pathological state that is defined by harm to self and or others.
Hmm.
So if we're engaging in any activity, such that we are harming ourselves or harming other people, even if we can't see that harm, but other people can see the harm,
Hmm.
then we're in addiction land. And
Hmm.
certainly people who achieve great things, or who have a passion, or who
Hmm.
work obsessively or apply themselves obsessively to a certain endeavor, it's not
Right.
addiction
Hmm.
unless it's maladaptive. Now, the issue here is that our society rewards workaholism, and
Hmm.
it rewards materialism and wealth and fame. And really, I don't think those things are healthy, but because our society sees them as things that we should strive for, we don't typically call out workaholism, right? Or we
Right.
don't call out
We reward.
money addiction, right? We see, but I can tell you, working with some very famous, very rich, very successful people, they're not happy.
Ah.
These are not enviable lives, no
Hmm.
matter how they might appear on the outside. And many of these people themselves feel like they're on a treadmill, and are trying to get off, and can't figure out how to do it. So,
Right.
the idea is really to find that balance.
And it's also down to the society which we are a part of, right? Where if we see
That's
somebody
right.
driving a very swanky car, it doesn't matter whether his personal life is is gone completely astray, but he's a successful man or a woman for that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think individuals can be sick, but a society can be sick too.
Hmm.
And when you're living in a sick society, it's that much harder to find, your own
Right.
health, because you'd have to go against the grain. And I do think we are there. I think,
Hmm.
this sort of capitalist system, which in a way is very well suited to human striving, in
Right.
another way seeks to make all of us compulsive overconsumers.
Right.
In the sense that that is the end product of a successful capitalist system, is that we would all at some point become addicted to something.
Right. And on that count, I was listening to an interview of a journalist on a BBC. That journalist was captured or kidnapped by, I think, some group in Syria, and he was let go after 9 months. So the BBC interviewer in the end asked, "So what are the plans? What do you plan to do next?" He said he was going to Afghanistan now to cover the
Oh,
war-torn area there.
yeah,
So, and I was lying in bed feeling very bad about myself, saying, "Hey, look at the ambition of the guy," and that he's a junkie to cover that kind of
yeah,
news. You call it that,
right,
or it is pure
yeah,
passion towards that. I was born to do that.
yeah,
Now, here
right,
I'll go back to your definition. Isn't that a definition of causing harm to oneself and also to the family back home, that he's putting himself
yeah,
in
mhm,
positions where you shouldn't, perhaps? Or I
yeah.
don't know. I mean, it's
Yeah,
a
no,
hard one.
I think you're right. So if we were in a society that really valued families,
Hmm.
we would have very different definitions of success.
Yeah. Right. Got it.
Mhm.
This, I think Robert Capa, wasn't he, the guy who covered all those wars? And even he was there on the D-Day. He was a photographer, the only civilian photographer at the Omaha beach. And he said, if your photographs are not good enough, you are not close enough. in that, there were no lens at the
Wow.
time. So he had to be
Yeah.
in the midst
Right.
action. And so that's taking it to the other extreme, but then
Right.
that's how you become geniuses. Or is that the price
Right.
that you pay for obsessive love for your passion? Is
Yeah.
that then is perhaps death for all we know? So would you count that as addiction or pure
I
how would
mean,
you
I
put
don't,
that?
yeah, it's hard.
Hmm.
It's a great point because, but I think, if we overuse this sort of concept of addiction and we apply it to every situation,
Yeah.
then we sort of dilute it.
Right.
Because I mean, certainly that could be seen as an act of bravery and heroism,
Hmm.
to be remembered for the ages,
Right.
right? So it's not that every extreme behavior, but it's
Yeah.
really more, addiction is really more like getting caught in this loop
Hmm.
where there's a real gap between what we perceive the
Right.
behavior to be doing and what it's really doing. That gap is really, at the heart of addiction.
Right.
Whereas you could argue that journal, I mean, he's risking something, he's passionate, he's driven. Yes, he's potentially going to harm himself by getting
Hmm.
closer, but there's not like a diluted gap
Hmm.
between, there might be a gap between the value of that at the
Yeah.
risk of his life. And we could argue that it's not worth it, right?
Hmm.
But maybe it is worth it. I don't know, and then
Right.
in which case it's an act of heroism, not an addictive process.
Right. And somebody has got to do it, and that people should know the truth. That would be one line of reasoning.
Yes, that's right.
And to come out of that loop, you write that willpower, which is what people talk about, that hey, you have to will yourself through it, may not be the
Right.
best way of getting around it. And you write that it's just like a muscle that is overused. Willpower
Right.
can also get tired.
Yeah.
How do you mean that? That's an interesting take.
Yeah. So, I mean, we wake up in the morning with more willpower than we're going to have through the course of the day, which is why so many people with addiction will wake up and say, I'm not going to use today. And by 5 o'clock, they're using.
Right.
Because if we rely on willpower alone, especially in this dopamine saturated world that we live in, where we're constantly being triggered, we're not going to be successful. Which is why we have to use self-binding to create these barriers between
Hmm.
ourselves and our drug of choice to help extend our willpower and our ability
Right.
to, achieve our goals, which is, in this case, our goal of abstaining or moderating use.
Right. So if I don't want to eat junk food, I should not stock them in the house. So that's a very simple way of putting it
Exactly.
away, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yes.
Right.
Yes. You
And
got it.
also, one mind-boggling thing that I read in your book and also one of your podcasts is that it's important not to lie. Even
Ah, yes.
casual lying in your
Right.
day-to-day things, you say that
Yeah.
it has a neurological connection as well. Can you explain that? Because that's
Yeah. So
yeah.
this is so interesting. So over the years, a consistent theme I've heard again and again from patients with very severe addictions who get into recovery
Mm,
from those addictions is that one of the things that they have learned is that they cannot lie. It's not just they can't lie about using their drug. They can't lie about anything. If
mm,
they start little lies like, oh, sorry, I'm late, traffic was bad, instead of just sorry, I'm late,
yeah.
I wanted more time to read the paper type thing, then that sends them tripping down a road of relapse and addiction.
Ah,
And it's so interesting how it works. We don't know for sure, but probably what it is that when we get up in the morning and we make a commitment to not lying, that's effort, because the average adult tells 1 to 2 lies per day. These are usually little white lies to cover up our mistakes and selfishness. And to not lie takes effort. We have to actually pay attention to not lying.
right.
But by engaging in that effort, what we're probably doing is strengthening our prefrontal cortex,
Mhm.
which is a part of our brain that's looped into this reward pathway that actually allows us to delay gratification and put the brakes on consumption. It's also true that when we're not lying,
Mm,
we end up having the ability to tell true stories about where we've been and what we've done. And those truthful autobiographical narratives provide a way not just to organize past experience, but also a roadmap for the future. So we have access to the actual data of what we're doing, how we're spending their time, what
right.
other people have done. We're more aware, right? And again, in that awareness, able to have more access to good information to make good choices. Telling the truth also encourages deep intimacy, and intimacy with other human beings is a healthy alternative source of dopamine, as long as it's a
Right.
healthy kind of intimacy. And we know that when we tell people like the mistakes we've made and the ways in which, we've lied, cheated, or
Mm.
stolen. We think people are going to go running like, ew, get away, yucky. But in fact, the opposite happens, and people feel that, feel the kind of shared humanity,
Right.
and they come closer to us. So if we've done something wrong, we tell the truth, we apologize. That leads to a burst of healthy dopamine, which then fosters intimacy, and then that true intimacy can help people abstain from addiction, because often the addictive substance or behavior is a replacement for deep human connection. So
And
those are just some of the reasons that it works.
right. Right. And it also rewires the brain, is what you
Yes.
think.
Yes.
So it's got a
Yeah.
proper neurological
Yes.
reason for it. And I know we're running out of time. Just a last couple of them is in your first um advice to those who want to wean themselves off a bad thing is to abstain. Generally, from with your patients, how many of them say, "Hey, that's impossible. You're asking me to stop smoking up or do cocaine because these are real hard, excuse me,
Right.
addictions." So how do you square with them that, hey, this you need to do this because you can't be with them and you can't police them because
Right.
they're on their own when they leave your office. So
Mhm.
how do you get them in that 20 minutes to an hour
Yeah.
conversation? How do you get them to come to see your side of things?
The way that I try to invite them into a willingness to do that experiment is to really hook it into what they came to see me for. And many people come to see, so they want help with something, right?
Mm.
They're not getting along with their parents. They're not exercising. They've gained weight.
Yeah.
They're depressed. They're anxious. And what I propose to them is that, if you abstain from this behavior, for this substance for 4 weeks, that thing that you want help with may get better without our having to do anything else at all. Because by changing dopamine reward pathways, you will come out of that dopamine deficit state. You'll feel better. You'll be less anxious, less depressed, more present, more confident. Your relationships will improve. So that's really the hook. And then I really, explain to them the neuroscience, the pleasure pain balance. And by understanding what's going on in the brain, that helps people have a framework for tuning into what they're feeling when they're feeling it.
Right. And I think there was one of your patients in the book you write about, I think she was using some drugs, and you asked her to consider her current behavior in light of her future self. So would you like to be doing this 3 years down the line is a question that we need to ask. So anything that casts a vote, I think it's in another book called Atomic Habits, where that author says that, if it casts a vote against your future identity, then don't do it against it. So, it sounds very commonsensical, doesn't it? So does it baffle you that many people, including me with ice creams for that matter, are seemingly harmless as compared to alcoholism? We still make those mistakes, that we don't get common sense, as it's not as common as one would like it to be then.
It doesn't really baffle me, because I do think that it's actually a really hard time to be alive in ways that are paradoxical and non-obvious, which is to say that this world of overabundance is not the world that we were designed for. And it stresses us in these exceptional ways that cause a lot of suffering and also make us feel guilty because we feel like we shouldn't feel sad, right? We shouldn't be struggling. We have so much, and yet we are. And so I think understanding why and how this is affecting our brains is super helpful. And then recognizing that we're really slaves to our environment, and that we can't expect our behaviors to change if we don't change our environment, our immediate environment.
Right. And the last one is because the name of the book is Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. So I'll put you on a spot, because there is no playbook for, living the most virtuous or what is that word? Conscientious life. What would your definition be of what is that balance that you tell yourself or your patients? Because your book is also very personal, where you have poured your heart out and talked about your own addiction, because that's how you put it there. And so what is that balance according? How best should we be aiming for it, and so that we'll be happy to be using not the feelings kind, but that, hey, okay, that is how it is. What's that balance?
Well, I think in a way it starts with not aiming for happiness, recognizing that we're wired for suffering, that life is very hard, and that we can mitigate suffering by taking the pursuit of pleasure out of our primary goal orientation and instead just embracing pain and recognizing that life is difficult, having empathy for ourselves, for other people, and then doing our best to find meaning and purpose in things that are hard, which is really, the true state of our lived experience.
Excellent. It reminds me of Jordan Peterson, the clinical psychologist from Canada, who says that we have to bear the responsibility of the highest order that you can, you can shoulder, perhaps, and that's where you find your, joy, if there is
a
word
that's
like
right.
that.
Right. And that you can be in a place where when a rainbow appears, you can appreciate it, right? So you can't make the rainbow appear, but you can adjust your life so that when a rainbow comes, you notice it.
Yes, and that you just don't sit down and wait for the rainbow to appear, not doing anything.
Right.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lembke, for your time. This has been wonderful, and I really enjoyed talking with you.
Me too. I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. You have a
You're
great day,
welcome.
Dr. Lembke.
You
I'll send this link in a few days' time.
Good. And keep up the great work with your little guy. It sounds like you're a wonderful
thank you.
parent.
That's very kind of you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.